Hello, and welcome to today's event hosted by the Council on Criminal Justice. This morning, the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice released its interim report, recommending immediate actions for the field to take to control the pandemic. Today, we are honored to be joined by the Commission's co-chairs and members to discuss their work and the path forward. I'm Abby Walsh. In addition to staffing the Commission, I'm the Vice President here at the Council on Criminal Justice. And before we begin our program, a few notes for you. We will be joined today by nearly 400 participants, including policymakers, the public, and the media. To ensure a quality experience for everyone, all lines will be muted, but we do want to hear from you. Throughout today's session, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or email us at info@counciloncj.org throughout today's event. We will take as many questions as possible at the end of today's session. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Adam Gelb, President and CEO of the Council on Criminal Justice. Adam?
Thank you so much, Abby. Our mission at the Council is to advance understanding of the criminal justice policy choices facing the nation and to build consensus for solutions that enhance safety and justice for all. Now, the COVID Commission embodies this. Its interim report is a comprehensive one-stop snapshot of what's happening across the system and a strategic guide to what needs to be done going forward to stop and limit the damage of the virus. It reflects the most recent trends, the latest research, and the best thinking of leaders from across the major sectors of the field. It's been our honor at the Council to convene such a diverse and distinguished group of leaders. The Council aims to create a center of gravity for the field, a forum where everyone has a voice, where we can have serious, civilized discussions on vital issues, and where we can ask tough questions and seek honest answers without demonizing people who disagree. Today, you'll have a window into that kind of collaboration with 5 of our commissioners, 2 former U.S. Attorneys General, a big city mayor, a top public health researcher, and a leading criminologist. I think their work meets the magnitude of this moment. It recognizes that lives are on the line, that people's rights and equality and dignity are on the line, that public confidence in our justice system and our democracy are on the line, and that even though everyone is exhausted from the past 7 months, there is urgency not only to keep it up, but to step it up to the next level. Now, I want to commend and thank the members of the Commission for dedicating their time, their expertise and experience to this effort, despite being on the front lines and navigating the pandemic and the protests and even massive wildfires with their staffs and the citizens they serve. We're especially grateful to Attorneys General Lynch and Gonzales. No one seems to be able to recall the last time Attorneys General from 2 different parties actually rolled up their sleeves and worked together on a joint project. That the 2 of you are doing so here and now in this polarized environment is lost on no one. The diversity of the Commission is reflected well in its funders. Arnold Ventures, based in Texas, MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, the Schusterman Foundation, based in Tulsa, Microsoft, of course, out in Washington State, the Justice Mobility Fund, based in New York. Thanks to you for the support that's making this work possible. I'm going to turn it over now to the co-chairs and then to the Commission Director, Thomas Abt, the former official of the Justice Department in the state of New York, who's now a senior fellow with the Council. Thomas, you and Abby, along with Charlotte, Jennifer, Andrew, and the rest of the CCJ team have done an absolutely amazing job processing and making sense out of insane amounts of information, facilitating the Commission's deliberations and assembling it all into what's really a gorgeous package. With that, Attorney General Lynch, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam. All right, let me welcome everyone here. I'm delighted to be here joined by my esteemed co-chair, former Attorney General and Judge Gonzales, as well as the other members of the Commission. We look forward to sharing our work with all of you. We hope that all of you are safe and well in what has been our time here in Corona land. I think it is fair to say that this has been a year unlike any of us have faced. To say, of course, that coronavirus and the resulting pandemic has had a wrenching impact on our society and on our community and on our daily lives is, of course, to utter a profound understatement. But in particular, the impact on the criminal justice system has been extreme. These pressures that the criminal justice system has faced as a result of this pandemic have already exacerbated challenges that the system faced back in the days that we used to call normal. Now, as we saw COVID-19 sweep the country, one thing that all of those who live and work in the justice system, ranging from law enforcement officials, judges, corrections officers, leaders of community organizations, they've all had to face the grim reality that, like every citizen, we were not prepared for this. Without the lack of clear national guidance, without initial reliable data to guide actions, those who were seeking to protect individuals who live and work in the system adopted a number of different ways of doing so. These ways often were inconsistent and they had varying degrees of success. And these well-meaning efforts led in many instances to confusion and greater inequity in our response to this pandemic. But just by way of one example, as we all know, we have seen different infection rates and different mortality rates in various parts of our country based upon the reaction to this pandemic. And the criminal justice system is no exception there. When we look at the infection rates and sadly the mortality rates, we see variances there as well. In some states, the death rates for people in prison is many times greater than that of the overall population, as much as 14 times greater in one instance. But as we saw with various states, where institutions were able to obtain reliable data and to act early, to act decisively, and take far-reaching measures to contain the virus to the best of their ability, we saw a much, much less severe impact. And that knowledge helped guide us as we looked at recommendations and ways to give advice to leaders for actions that they could take right now, literally today, to both stop the spread of the virus, to contain the spread of the virus, and to prevent it from entering the criminal justice system. I'm just going to touch on a few of the recommendations. We will, of course, discuss them in more detail during our time together this afternoon. First, how do we stop the growth of this virus? Well, we use scientifically proven measures: physical distancing, masking, and mass testing. That has to be our gold standard as we help adapt the criminal justice system to deal with this pandemic. Second, as with the rest of society, we need to limit interpersonal contact. That's difficult in the criminal justice system where so many interactions are face-to-face. So much of the work of the system, from investigation through arrest and incarceration and beyond, is face-to-face. But we have to look at ways to limit custodial arrests while still maintaining safely, reduce admissions to jails, and also look at ways in which we can decarcerate our jails and prisons safely and securely, keeping in mind both efforts to maintain public health and public safety. Third, communication. Communication is the key to making sure that not only are our recommendations heard, but that information is shared consistently and evenly throughout the criminal justice system. We have to find ways to communicate quickly and transparently with staff, with the justice-involved populations and their families, and the public. But it's not just that we have to communicate, it's what we need to communicate. We have to make sure that we are providing the most up-to-date data and guidance on how to manage this pandemic. We have to provide information on infection rates and mortality rates so that communities can assess what tools they're using and what tools they need to adopt. And finally, we have to engage those individuals who are most impacted by this pandemic and the criminal justice system. We have to engage them in decision-making, and we have to get their input. And especially we have to make sure that we include those communities whose voices are often not heard in these discussions, poor communities and communities of color. We know that racial disparities plague the criminal justice system. We know that racial disparities plague the healthcare system, and that this pandemic has come together to exacerbate those problems in both. As we work to make sure the criminal justice system deals with this pandemic in a way that is safe, that is efficient, that is fair, we also must make sure we do not further exacerbate any of those inequalities. It has truly been an honor to work with this outstanding group of people, the commissioners and staff alike, on this important work. And now I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to my distinguished co-chair, former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales.
Thank you, General Lynch. It's been a pleasure as well for me to be able to work with you and the dedicated staff and other fellow commissioners. I want to thank all the commissioners and the staff again for your efforts to get this I think a very strong report out the door in a very quick fashion, I might add. We've worked hard. We're eager to present today's consensus recommendations, and we believe they are stronger because of the diverse group that makes up this commission. Our commissioners include sheriffs and corrections directors, judges, leaders of community-based organizations, and many others working tirelessly right on the front lines during this pandemic. And we were also fortunate to receive testimony from researchers, community organizations, and directly impacted people who've experienced, sadly, firsthand, the challenges of COVID-19 and what it presents for our justice system. Their experience and knowledge directly contributed to these recommendations. Now, ultimately, our goal as a commission and with these recommendations is to encourage leaders of the system to keep pushing and to push harder. We've already talked about everyone working hard and being tired. Everyone's tired, and that's understandable. But this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we must take more aggressive measures to preserve lives and public health, always keeping in mind our central mission of public safety. So what's next? General Lynch highlighted some of the recommendations justice system leaders can take right now to stop the spread of COVID-19. And we'll all talk more about that during our discussion. I also want to tell you that over the next 2 months, the Commission will evaluate the lessons learned from the pandemic and its management and develop recommendations that address the broader challenges facing our justice system. We'll be answering, or certainly try to answer, some critical questions about this pandemic that has been elevated in the national conscience, such as how can we ensure that our justice system operates more fairly and effectively, particularly, as General Lynch said, for communities of color and lower income Americans. How can we better integrate our public safety and public health efforts? We look forward to an invigorating discussion today and to the Q&A that follows this presentation. I want to say on behalf of General Lynch, thank you for joining us. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Judge Gonzales. We're now going to turn to the discussion portion of today's webinar. As you've heard, I'm Thomas Apt, and right now I will be serving as your moderator. With me, in addition to co-chairs Lynch and Gonzales, is Mayor Eric Johnson of Dallas, Texas. Prior to his election last year, Mayor Johnson served in the Texas House of Representatives for almost 10 years. Also with me is Dr. Tom Inglesby, who leads the Center for Health Security of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Inglesby has authored or co-authored more than 140 publications related to epidemics, biological threats, and disasters. Finally, we have Professor Stephen Raphael, a distinguished professor of public policy at the University of California at Berkeley, where much of his research focuses on the economics of crime and corrections. General Lynch, if you're willing, we'll begin with you. The Commission is calling for a series of measures to limit contact between the public and the criminal justice system. For instance, recommending that police officers reduce in-person responses as well as arrests. In policing and elsewhere, how should criminal justice officials minimize contact with the public while at the same time keeping them safe?
Well, thank you for that question, Thomas. I think it's one that comes to many people's minds because, of course, we must always balance public safety and make sure that's an important part of any discussion of policing. But I think we have to look at how we actually police during a pandemic. And when we talk about certain kinds of typical police interactions, for example, where police are typically called to provide a police report for an accident, where there are calls for non-urgent calls for service, traffic issues and the like, we can and in fact should be thinking of whether we actually need to deploy police to that particular situation. Similarly, there are certain types of calls that not just this commission, but other members of the community have raised issues as to whether or not we need police to be the first responders for individuals in mental health crises, or where there are public health issues, for example, mask enforcement. You know, do we actually need to have the police be the first responders there and have primary responsibility for that? Or are there ways in which we can either deploy medical personnel who will themselves be protected, wearing masks and gloves as appropriate, or in the case of these lesser need law enforcement interactions, use online reporting, you know, find another way to provide those reports and the like. And so I think that those are some of the things that we can do right away. Also, where oftentimes, you know, police will be involved in a situation where it's a low-level offense, a misdemeanor, and there's a custodial arrest. The person's given a desk appearance ticket and they come back and they report in several months. You know, I think we have to really think through, does there need to be a custodial arrest in those circumstances? Can someone be issued a summons and a ticket on the spot and then, you know, released to return later, as opposed to exposing them and the officers to further risk by moving them through the system? So those are just some of the things and some of the ways that which we can limit the in-person contact and still maintain public safety.
Thank you very much, General. Judge Gonzales, you and your fellow commissioners recommend many restrictions regarding court hearings, trials, and access to courts generally. How should judges and other court administrators protect the public from COVID-19 while respecting the constitutional rights of criminal defendants?
Thomas, I think the key here, of course, is in looking not only at protecting the health of individuals involved in the court system. We also need to, of course, as you say, balance protection of constitutional rights. That's always going to be important in these kinds of proceedings. And so the kinds of things that we looked at is the ability to perhaps restrict jury trials, again, consistent with the protection of constitutional rights. The greater use of technology in order to limit in-person proceedings. We want to lower the density in courthouses and facilities around courthouses. We wanted to we made recommendations with respect to distancing and mask and doing an evaluation of the courthouse itself, courthouse facility, to make sure that we're taking advantage of what's available to further protect health. Perhaps for larger proceedings, look at other facilities like a neighboring gymnasium or a large ballroom, for example. We also want to limit public access. Obviously, the public has an interest in knowing how our public courts are doing, but there are some things that can be done to limit public access in appropriate circumstances. And then, of course, we looked at processes or procedures with respect to fines and fees. Can those be suspended? Can those be dealt with in alternative ways? So these are some of the ways that some of the things that we looked at and most concerned about. But again, always driven by the notion that that courts generally are subject to budget restrictions. They're also subject to providing and protecting constitutional rights and protecting the safety of the public and those involved in the court system. But we believe with the measures that are in this report, we can achieve all those and still make progress in protecting the health of the community.
Thank you, Judge Gonzales. Dr. Inglesby, the recommendations released today contain some strong language regarding universal masking and mass testing. From a public health perspective, please take us through the reasoning behind these recommendations and tell us where in the criminal justice system these measures are most urgently needed.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, the Commission is making strong recommendations around masking and testing. And it's recommending universal masking because there is strong public health evidence, very compelling evidence that wearing masks slows the spread of this virus. One challenge with COVID is that people can get this disease, but have no symptoms and still spread it. So it's really important for people who are living and working in correctional settings in particular, or who are working in the criminal justice system more broadly, to wear masks whenever around other people in the system, in their workplaces, or in these settings, because it's just not possible to tell by looking at someone if he or she is infected and contagious. And we're also strongly recommending a rigorous testing program in the criminal justice system, particularly in corrections facilities where the risks of outbreaks is very high. In correctional facilities, Incarcerated people should all be tested when they enter a new facility or are transferred. And certainly anyone with any symptoms of COVID, whether it's someone who's incarcerated or staff in those facilities, should be tested as soon as symptoms appear and be isolated should they become positive. Hopefully test results can be made to come back the same day when we can take action quickly. And there should also be facility-wide frequent screening done on people who are working in these facilities and people who are incarcerated, something that now will become much more feasible as rapid antigen testing becomes more available across the country. And the criminal justice system should be a priority for that testing. And if we take these steps, the Commission strongly believes that we will be able to reduce the risk of transmission across the system.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor Raphael, you and your fellow commissioners are calling, in addition to these protective measures that Dr. Inglesby talked about, calling for reducing prison and jail populations in order to reduce density and improve distancing. What are the best ways to do this, consistent with public safety?
Sure, Thomas, thank you for that question. Typically, prison and jail populations are quite fluid, with many people being admitted and released over short periods of time. And so basically drawing down a population either requires that you reduce admissions or you're going to increase releases. And past experience at the state and local level has shown that both avenues or both tools can be used to quite quickly reduce density and overcrowding. For jails, to build on the suggestion that Attorney General Lynch had suggested, making greater use of citation and release in the field for less serious misdemeanor offenses, as well as greater and targeted use of pretrial supervised release for those who cannot make bail, right, can clearly relieve overcrowding. For prisons, one could reduce admissions for technical parole violations, which in some instances, and some very salient instances, have led to sizable reductions in daily prison counts. And facilities could strategically use early release of individuals with small amounts of time to serve who are lower risk or who are at high medical risk. And then, of course, for the currently incarcerated, in prison reentry planning is key, and things such as developing housing plans, ensuring continuum of care for medical and mental health care, and aiding with basic issues like acquiring identification can greatly smooth transition back into society, especially during the first few weeks after release.
Thank you, Professor. Mayor Johnson, these recommendations address policing, courts, and corrections, but they also address a fourth sector of the criminal justice system that sometimes doesn't get much recognition. I'm referring to community-based, non-governmental groups that work to prevent crime, provide services, promote rehabilitation, and do other things. Why was it important to include these organizations here, and what role do they play in stopping the spread of COVID-19?
Well, I appreciate the question, Thomas. I think that there is a tendency in city government to believe that every problem that affects a city resident is actually the city's responsibility to address. And I can tell you, I became mayor at large parts. I want to try to help people. I'm the mayor of my hometown, in fact. So I have that same sort of mentality. But the reality is that city government is actually, there's some issues at times with us being the primary deliverer of services or doing certain things. One of the first things that I'd point out to folks is that city government is actually structurally and resource constrained in some cases. So like in the city of Dallas's case, we actually aren't set up and we aren't structured to really be the tip of the spear on public health issues. We don't run our own health department. Some cities do. Some cities in Texas do. We're not one of them. Our county is the tip of the spear on public health. And so sometimes the resources aren't necessarily there. Another issue is that sometimes we're not the most nimble. We're not the fastest in delivering services because we have to vote on everything. There's a process involved. And even in a pandemic or a declared emergency where things can be accelerated somewhat, we still can't spend taxpayer dollars as nimbly as some other entities can. And then I think the last thing I'd say that makes city government sometimes not ideal to be the tip of the spear on some of these issues is that we have credibility gaps in some cases. There are certain communities and for various reasons that don't necessarily trust the city government or certainly law enforcement in some cases to be the primary deliverer of certain services. So with that being said, your question is, what role will these non-governmental organizations play? I think a huge role, and they have been playing a huge role in Dallas. So one of the things that I did first as mayor once this pandemic sort of set in was I used my disaster relief funds to directly fund some nonprofit organizations who could address some of those structural issues I just identified, who could act more nimbly and had more credibility in various communities to go out and do certain things like assist with evictions and assist with all manner of dealing with the economic fallout from the pandemic and also some of the public health aspects of it. We leaned on our ethnic chambers of commerce to make sure that they were reaching out into the various communities on PPE distribution and things like that. And we relied heavily on the faith community as well to increase testing capacity. People were more excited about going and being tested in the African-American community at an African-American church, for example, than a government test site or a test site that was perceived to be from law enforcement or the government. So I'd say that there's no question that in Dallas, we have been helped tremendously by our non-governmental community-based organizations in dealing with every aspect of the pandemic, for sure.
Thank you, Mayor, for that answer. Much appreciated. Judge Gonzales, I want to come back to you. You mentioned budget restrictions. The mayor just did as well. The focus of these recommendations is immediate action. What can be done right now? So how can criminal justice leaders, when they're facing flat or even reduced budgets, allocate their resources strategically when they respond to this pandemic?
Yeah, I think it requires prioritization, quite frankly, Thomas, and thank you for that question. Budgets have taken a hit all across the nation. There's no question about it at various levels of our governments. And having led both the federal and state agency, I know what it's like when the legislature or the governor decides that we're going to do across-the-board budget cuts indiscriminately. And oftentimes good programs are terribly affected, devastated. So it seems to me that what preferable way, hopefully a better way, assuming that there's the will and the time to do so, is to identify the priorities in these various sectors and then have a dialogue with your those individuals making budget decisions and having them understand fully the repercussions of certain budget decisions and how and their potential devastating effect upon the criminal justice system. But clearly, it seems to me within every sector, within every entity, within every agency, there needs to be a priority in terms of what are our greatest needs in terms of protecting the health and safety of our community and ensuring that we're protecting constitutional rights. And obviously all of us understanding that there are budget limitations. It's the world that we live in. And so we've got to make some smart decisions going forward.
Thank you, Judge. General Lynch, the report notes, and you yourself noted in your opening statement, that the absence of clear guidance and reliable information has produced some inconsistency in the criminal justice responses to COVID-19 from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What are some of the consequences of that inconsistency? And how do the recommendations that you're releasing today address this issue?
Certainly, that's a very important issue. Anytime we have something new and as troubling and as dangerous as COVID-19, there is, of course, a desire to gather as much knowledge as possible and to make sure that we're relying upon the most trusted sources of that knowledge. And obviously, with something as new as this and as challenging as this pandemic, there have been any number of challenges to get to building trust in that knowledge. Mayor Johnson actually alluded to one very important challenge, which is many different communities don't necessarily have faith in their systems of government or law enforcement when they hear information. So the challenge that we see is how do you have how do you essentially refer people to consistently accurate and trusted sources of knowledge and information? And where we have seen people essentially go wildly in different directions, we've seen real variances in both the infection rate and the fatality rate as this pandemic has moved across the country, both in the communities, but also in the criminal justice system. We've seen some states where they've acted decisively and they have worked to release individuals who were able to be released. They have worked on universal standards of PPE and the like. And some incarceratory institutions have not had fatalities from COVID-19. But there's a cluster of them that are leading the way in a way that we don't want them to be leaders in this field. There's about 4 or 5 correctional institutions that have more fatalities than the population that they occupy in their states. And certainly within the criminal justice system, they're a very, very high percentage of fatalities. And so when we look at how different entities manage this, we see them relying on different sources of data and different ways of managing it. This report and the recommendations that we are making strives for consistency, and it strives to guide and direct people to the universally recognized leaders in the field of scientific inquiry in this way, the CDC, the World Health Organization, and most importantly, we're striving for consistency across the board, particularly in the correctional institutions as they're managing large numbers of people who live and work in those institutions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Professor Raphael, you and the other commissioners call for actively engaging impacted communities and involving them in decision-making. But how does that happen when some of the most impacted individuals are behind bars? How did the commission engage such individuals, and what impact did it have on your recommendations, particularly for prisons and jails?
Well, that's always a challenge, since clearly it's more difficult to communicate with someone who is incarcerated relative to someone who's not. The commission was fortunate to work directly with both commissioners and staff who have long histories of working and advocating for incarcerated persons, and some have experienced incarceration firsthand. And we also benefited greatly from written and oral testimony provided by a wide array of people and organizations, including individuals who were released from incarceration during the pandemic, family members of incarcerated persons, correctional officers, prison and jail medical service providers, and reentry service providers, just to name a few. And these engagements and this feedback really sensitized us to a number of things. So first of all, it sensitized us to how COVID has made tense and stressful environments and interactions even more so for both law enforcement, for the public, for incarcerated persons, and for correctional staff. The testimony also made salient how some of the responses to COVID are likely to make the conditions of confinement more difficult for incarcerated persons along several dimensions, and the working conditions for staff in correctional institutions more difficult as well. And then finally, the engagement clearly highlighted for us the need for open communication and transparency between all impacted groups, whether it be between administrators and staff and correctional officers, between correctional officers and incarcerated people, or between institutions and the families of people that are currently incarcerated. So the feedback, I think, was fundamental and central to many of our recommendations.
Thank you, Professor. Mayor, I'd like to turn back to you. As someone who leads a large city, you are called on to make difficult trade-offs every single day. How should local justice officials balance the need to protect the public from COVID-19 with the need to protect them from crime?
Again, I appreciate that question. And, I guess the short answer is we have to do both. We absolutely have to do both. And it's a challenge for sure. But I think that General Lynch and the commission hit on the theme in this report that is really what the bottom line is for what we have to do here, which is we have to minimize interaction. We have to minimize the interaction between law enforcement and our populations during this pandemic. So we obviously have to make sure that our first responders have the PPE they need. And that's, I mean, we have to look at our protocols and things with our law enforcement agencies to make sure they're protected. But one of the things that I was working on as a mayor long before we actually had this pandemic set in, but which is turning out to be quite fortuitous in Dallas, is trying to figure out ways to use non-law enforcement entities and non-law enforcement personnel to actually reduce crime, thereby eliminating the need for the interaction in the first place. So I formed a task force when I first became mayor. Dallas was experiencing a violent crime spike a year before the rest of the nation actually started to. So the whole country is sort of spiking now, but Dallas was spiking a year ago. And so when I took office, I formed this task force and said, and this was controversial, actually. Some people criticized me for this. I said, I would like you guys to bring me back some solutions to reduce violent crime in the city, but I don't want it to involve law enforcement. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, we need to figure out ways that the community can help reduce crime that don't rely on law enforcement. And then once they realized that was serious, they actually went to work on it and came back with 4 very brilliant recommendations. One had to do with blight reduction. One had to do with increasing lighting in some areas of our city where just frankly, our utility in our city hadn't, the street lights weren't on and weren't working. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And then one, which is, we talked about in this report, which is a big deal, was violence interrupter programs, using members of the community who have credibility with the community, who are not attached to law enforcement in any way. In fact, and some of them are formerly incarcerated, former gang members, and you have it. The key is they have credibility. There's that theme again. When we're dealing with the community, it's very important that the folks we send have credibility. So these folks are using that position that they have in the community to help defuse disputes before they become violent in the first place. And then we have another recommendation from the committee that had to do with social emotional learning in our schools and making sure kids learn in school how to resolve differences without resorting to violence. The upshot of all those recommendations is if we do those things well, and I'm proud to say the city of Dallas's budget that we just adopted last week is funding all of those things. The idea is you never have to call law enforcement out in the first place. And that gets to what General Lynch and the commission was saying, is if we can eliminate the interaction, it actually has a great public health benefit. And that's what we are committed to doing here. And I think that's something that people around the country are looking at.
Thank you, Mayor. As we start to wrap up this section of the report, I want to turn back to you, Dr. Inglesby, and go back to the science. The commission stressed that criminal justice leaders needed to be proactive in dealing with COVID-19. And the commission, from much of the text in the recommendations, appeared to be deeply concerned about this risk of exponential growth. Can you explain what this means and why it's important?
Yeah, the concept of exponential growth is, it's a way of thinking about how quickly this disease is going to be spreading in our community if it's unchecked. And a particular disease or particular outbreak typically has a rate of growth which can be calculated. And in this case, in COVID, it's something between 2 and 3. And so what exponential growth means is that this outbreak, if unchecked in our institutions or in our communities, can spread 1 case to 2, 2 cases to 4, 4 cases to 8. And in that way, at least doubling in our communities or in our institutions in a way that's a lot faster than might seem obvious. And so it makes it really important to try to prevent outbreaks from getting going in the first place, because once they get going and they start doubling and then doubling again, it can really swamp the interventions that we're trying to put in place to slow it down. So I think exponential growth is it's a way of understanding that this disease can spread quite quickly, faster than it might seem at the beginning when things seem to be moving relatively slowly. And it really puts a strong premium on us doing everything we can to try and prevent outbreaks in the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, that concludes this section of the discussion, but now it's time to hear from all of you. And so I'm going to turn to Abby Walsh, my friend and colleague, to tell us what some of you are asking right now.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Thomas for moderating. And just a reminder, if you do have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll be able to relay as many of those as we have time for today. Our first question is coming in via email. Victims and survivors are also feeling the effects of the pandemic and shifts in our justice system. How were the needs and interests of victims and survivors considered in your work here on the Commission? Thomas, perhaps the corrections group, I know that Stephen Raphael was on that group, could speak to how this was considered in release discussions?
Sure. So we did in our discussion of release, we have emphasized that release needs to, occur in a deliberate way, right? It has to take into account the public safety implications of the decisions that are being made, and should take into account the information that correctional officials have regarding someone's stage in terms of whether they've made efforts and progress in programming, and frankly, indicators of risk that they might have information about. So we do know that there's great heterogeneity among populations of people that are incarcerated, both in terms of what people have done, how long their sentences are, and then also where they are in their life and the likelihood that they would return to prison if released. And we discussed that, and we believe that there is information that correctional authorities can make use of to try to selectively reduce population through admissions and releases.
Thank you, Professor. I also just want to note that this may be one of the first reports ever to really intentionally include this community-based approach where many victim services groups are operating, and to both shine a light on them, raise awareness of them, and to suggest that their funding absolutely needs to be maintained. And so, victim services group, violence interruption groups, this may be one of the first reports to really, with great intentionality, raise those groups up on a co-equal level with courts, corrections, and police.
Thank you, Thomas. Our next question relates to technology. Phaedra Haywood notes that in their community, the technology that's available within the court system is inadequate for the demands that are now being put on it, as so many services are being transitioned to technological means, especially in the court system. Judge Gonzales, you served on the subgroup for considering courts. How did access to technology and advances in technology factor into the discussion there, and what can be done to close these gaps?
Thank you, Abby, for that question. Yes, clearly technology is going to play an important role in so many ways in the court system, in terms of reducing density, in terms of changing procedures and policies and processes, protocols, with respect to various types of hearings and proceedings. We understand that in certain jurisdictions, there are limited budgets in terms of, and outdated technology, and that is something that we share as a serious concern. And we also understand that perhaps with respect to people out in the community who have business with the court system, and if we want to lower density, can technology be used to interact to complete or further court business without having the individual actually come to the courthouse? But of course, many people, particularly in poorer communities, don't have access to that technology. And so I'm not sure that I can represent that we have a solution to that. I can say that we identify it as a serious problem if we want to make progress with respect to moving the process forward within our courts. Finding a way to fund new technology to replace outdated technology is important, not only within the court system, but also it is a serious challenge on many levels for people in our poor community just simply to live life, much less deal with our criminal justice system.
Thank you, Judge Gonzales. Our next question is coming from Alexis Picaro. Their question regards data. Data need to guide policy, yet some states and agencies are not forthcoming with data in prisons and jails. How do we get the criminal justice system and the federal government to commit to better data collection and dissemination?
That's a great question for Professor Raphael and for Dr. Inglesby. We'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Steve, you want to start?
Go ahead, Tom. Thanks.
So yes, it's true that it's been documented that that data reporting requirements around the country are quite different, and that in some places there's much less data being reported about who's getting infected and what procedures are in place in the criminal justice system. And this report is strongly calling for more transparency and strength in the reporting and in setting the standards, as Attorney General Lynch was talking about, for what we should all expect in the system. And I think that 50 states around the country all have different public health reporting requirements, and they do have different processes for collecting data. But I think one thing that we can all agree on, or should all agree on, is that data in high-risk institutions like corrections facilities should be transparent, and we should be monitoring that data carefully and looking for ways to improve outcomes based on that data. That's the core of public health response to infectious disease outbreaks in this country, and the criminal justice system should be at the center of that.
Steve?
Sure, I would just add from a researcher's perspective, the United States, our institutions are very decentralized. So we don't have one prison system, we have 51. And we don't have one jail system, we have over 3,000 basically, or not quite that many, but almost one for every county or for the majority of counties. And, in some instances there are standard reporting that occurs within states, but that differ across states. Sometimes you have different reportings across counties in terms of how basic criminal justice data is tabulated and presented to the public. And there are some counties, frankly, that are more open than others, and some states that provide more information than others for historic reasons or for legal reasons. And what we're learning is that in a public health crisis, that really presents a challenge to understanding what's going on, and also understanding the relative efficacy of the various interventions that different localities are trying. So better data infrastructure is clearly needed.
Thank you, Steve. I think another category that definitely sort of came out, a major gap that we saw, was the lack of information specifically with regard to race and ethnicities. And, as General Lynch mentioned, there's some disturbing signals that in some circumstances, responses to COVID-19 could be exacerbating racial disparities. We need the data to know whether in fact that's happening. And all too frequently, we don't have that data, at least not yet. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Our next question speaks to how communities are grappling with reentry challenges, and correctional systems are also preparing individuals for reentry into this very complicated time. So from Matthew Bulger, how can we better prepare local communities, either through education, research, resource provision, or other ways, to protect the community while also protecting returning citizens who are being released, perhaps to help with overcrowding and population density, and also people who would have normally been released during this time?
Mayor Johnson, can we come back to you for that?
I will do my best to speak to that somewhat. I think there are probably people more qualified than me to speak on it, because again, as a mayor, I'm not exactly the criminal justice expert here, but I will say this. Reentry is something that, going back to my days of the state legislature, I've been very, very concerned about making sure that our governments, state government and local government, are putting the resources we need to behind efforts to help people make that transition, and so that they're, and to push down recidivism. I think that's all the more important that we do now during COVID, because again, as it's been pointed out, anything that we can do to minimize that interaction and to push down on the inflow into our correctional facilities would be helpful. As a matter of equity, as a matter of justice, long before COVID ever hit, I think a lot of folks, including myself, have understood that it's good for everyone for us to take the steps needed to make sure that folks can re-enter society, get jobs, get housing, and get the type of services they need to live productive lives. During COVID, though, everything is being stressed. Everything's being strained. Resources, again, and this is just a common refrain that from a mayor who just went through a budget cycle. It's very difficult right now, and so what we are trying to do is to use every community partner that we can, and there are some quality community partners in Dallas that work on this issue, and so we're trying to leverage those relationships wherever we can. But it's an ongoing struggle, and we're fighting against, in some cases, and I know there are folks on this call who are familiar with the political history and climate that we're always working against when we talk about a reentry in a state that has a history of maybe more of a tough on crime mentality that we're having to slowly unwind and get people to understand that this is actually a net positive for society when we work on helping people make that transition. So, that's what I can tell you from my perspective, but I'm sure there are folks who have more of a nuts and bolts experience with the actual criminal justice system who might have something else to add. But that's how I look at it as a mayor. It's an equity issue for me.
Thomas, can I weigh in here?
Of course.
And just simply say that I think the mayor is absolutely right in terms of the best use of dollars is on programs like reentry, quite frankly. And I think we've tried to be very careful, though, with respect to the initial question about concern about releasing people and who perhaps aren't ready to get back into society. We try to be very careful in our recommendations and in our discussion in emphasizing that we understand there's an obligation to not only protect the public health, but protect the public safety, and that our recommendations are intended to do both of those achieve both of those objectives.
Thank you, Judge. Professor Raphael, you had a comment.
Sure, just really quickly. I just wanted to add that even when we're not in the middle of pandemic, reentry, especially those first few weeks after a long spell in prison, is a very, very tricky period for people, and they're at high risk for many things: for homelessness, for an overdose, for actually high risk of mortality, and a high risk of rearrest. People are coming out of prison with not a whole lot beyond what they have on the clothes on their back and a little bit of money, right? So they don't have the basic assets like, pots and pans and furniture and things that we take for granted that most of us have. And they have to start after being removed from society for a long time. So anything we can do to help that transition, and especially just basic things like having identification, are really, really important. And it's important now, especially during the pandemic when there's not that much employment, but it's important always.
Thank you so much. So our next question is coming to us for Attorney General Lynch. There are so many changes that are occurring as a result of COVID-19 and new approaches that are being put into place. Should any of these practices become a permanent part of the criminal justice system? How is the commission addressing that in its work?
Well, that's an excellent question, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about the fact that oftentimes challenging circumstances lead us to become creative and inventive in ways that actually have far-ranging positive consequences. As we were considering all of these issues, but particularly in the area of policing and corrections, we talked about the collateral consequences on so many challenged communities. We were very cognizant of the fact that in many ways, the pre-COVID reality really had not been the most positive situation for not just those communities, but also the criminal justice system. You know, a number of issues have been presented and we've been struggling with them over the course of this year as well. So it's our view that as communities look at these issues, particularly with regard to just, for example, policing, ways to limit contact but still maintain public safety by relying on technology, by relying on people using online services to file reports, by relying on other responders other than law enforcement for health issues, including mental health, that as those benefits become visible, that they will essentially become part of the way in which we think about public safety writ large. We always have to be ready to re-examine the ways in which we do these things, the ways in which we harness our resources, the ways in which we deploy our resources. And when we see things that we've been struggling with for some time, and we can find another way to manage those situations, if those ways turn out to be more successful, then it is our hope that they absolutely would become a positive contribution to the way in which we handle, for example, policing in this country, for the ways in which we handle corrections in this country. We just had a wonderful discussion on reentry, and certainly that is an important issue, but it is clear if you provide individuals with resources such as identification and Medicaid right upon their release from prison, their likelihood of going back in is much, much lower. And we talk about recidivism in sort of a generic sense, but what that means is not only has the person not gone back to prison, but there's no longer another victim of crime out there. So that does advance public safety. And those are some of the things that we do hope will continue after this pandemic is hopefully under control. You'll see in this report very, very common threads running throughout so many of these issues. The need for maintaining distance also is tied in with the need toward empowering the community organizations and empowering victim rights organizations to be more involved in these situations. So it's all interrelated. And we do think that many of the recommendations that we make are not just good pandemic policy, but good policy.
Thank you, General Lynch. Our last question is coming to us from KB Mensa and also Alton Brown. They're both asking about the experiences of people who are currently incarcerated or recently incarcerated during the pandemic. These were voices that we sought out in the Commission's work. To our commissioners, what were you hearing from people who are currently or recently incarcerated, and how was that most influential to the work?
Steve, go ahead.
Sure. So we had a number of formerly incarcerated people who were recently released provide oral testimony, and some family members as well. There were expressions of concern from everything from not being able to have a hot meal, right? Being given 3 sandwiches early in the day and for many, many days at a time, to not having any way to engage for long periods of time because programming had been halted, to uncertainty about what was happening in the same way that I think, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, when many of us, there was just so much uncertainty and fear and misinformation and apprehension. I think when people don't have control over their daily schedule, then that must be heightened. And then, of course, we heard from family members about not knowing if their loved ones were safe or if they were positive, if they were in the hospital. And then also, I guess one other thing that came up is there were issues that some folks had raised about whether people would be reluctant to report symptoms for fear of being placed in isolation and quarantine conditions that felt like solitary confinement. So that was among some of the things that we heard. Maybe, perhaps if others recall other things that were raised during our.
Well, as director, I sat and listened to every single person who gave testimony, and particularly with the directly impacted people, I think the theme that came across most powerfully to me personally was the lack of information, and really the fear and uncertainty that lack of clear information about what was being done in relation to COVID-19 and why really exacerbated the tensions that were there inevitably in response. So that to respond to the question, Abby, really came home to me.
Well, Thomas, with that, we've come up at the end of our scheduled time. We were scheduled to meet until 3 p.m. Eastern time. We want to thank everyone, especially all of our participants who have submitted their questions today, and all of our panelists who have joined us. Thomas, any closing words?
No, thank you to everyone who attended today, and thank you to our wonderful co-chairs and commission members for producing such excellent work in record time. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who joined us today. A recording of this session will be available on the Council and the Commission's websites within the next day. You can also access the report through either website. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.